Welcome to Watson's Journal, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The thread caught on Watson's cuff as he stepped into the doorway, a single strand of crimson silk that pulled taut and then broke with the faintest whisper of resistance. He lifted his hand to the gaslight and studied it. The fibre was unusually thick, twisted with a precision that spoke of manufacture rather than handicraft, and it carried the faint, waxy scent of beeswax, as though it had been drawn through a candle-maker's hands. The room beyond breathed with an unnatural stillness, the kind that follows a held breath or a stopped clock, and the strand trembled between his fingers as though it remembered the tension of whatever web it had once belonged to. The guest room itself seemed to have been suspended in amber. Fog pressed against the windows from outside, turning the glass into walls of luminous grey, and the gaslight from the hallway barely penetrated the threshold, as though reluctant to illuminate what lay within. Watson could hear, distantly, the sound of a teacup meeting a saucer somewhere below, the gentle murmur of women's voices in the drawing room, and the creak of the house settling into the November evening. But here, in this sealed chamber on the second floor of the Bloomsbury townhouse, there was only the peculiar quiet of a stage set before the curtain rises, or after it has fallen for the final time. The body hung in the centre of the room, suspended not from a rope or a beam, but from a vast web of red thread that stretched from wall to wall, ceiling to floor, creating a three-dimensional lattice that resembled nothing so much as a spider's geometric dream. The threads crossed and recrossed in patterns that suggested intention. Diagrams Watson had glimpsed in the margins of spiritualist pamphlets, the sort of occult geometry that claimed to map the pathways between worlds. The dead man, middle-aged, well-dressed in evening clothes now dishevelled, hung with his arms outstretched, his head tilted forward, threads wrapped around his wrists, his ankles, his chest, supporting his weight as though he had been caught mid-flight or mid-fall, and frozen there by some invisible hand. Watson noticed three things immediately about the web itself. First, the threads were all of identical quality and colour, that deep crimson that seemed to drink the gaslight rather than reflect it, suggesting they had been purchased as a single lot, prepared in advance. Second, the pattern was too perfect, too deliberate. Whoever had woven this had taken their time, worked with care and knowledge, measuring distances and angles with the precision of an architect or a sailor rigging a ship. Third, and most curious, the knots where the threads joined at the walls and furniture were not the sort of decorative loops one might expect from someone attempting to create a mystical symbol. They were sailors' knots, running bowlines and sheet bends, the sort Watson had learned to recognize during his years in the British Army, stationed aboard ships bound for Afghanistan. They were practical, efficient, designed to hold weight and withstand tension. And that, Watson thought as he stood very still in the doorway, was the contradiction that made his physician's mind pause and reconsider. If this were truly the work of spirits, of some supernatural force summoned by the séances that Mrs. Ashford had been hosting in her fashionable salon, why would the otherworldly employ the knots of the British Navy? "Don't touch anything, Doctor." Holmes's voice came from behind him, quiet and measured, and Watson stepped aside to let his friend approach the threshold. Sherlock Holmes moved with the unhurried grace of a man who had learned that crime scenes spoke most clearly to those who listened, without impatience, and he stopped precisely where Watson had stopped, at the border between the hallway's normalcy and the room's strangeness. He did not enter. He simply stood, hands clasped behind his back, and observed. The gaslight from the hallway carved Holmes's profile in amber and shadow. The sharp angles of his face, the focused intensity of his grey eyes, as they moved across the scene with the methodical pattern of someone reading a page of complicated music. Watson had learned, over their years of acquaintance, to remain silent during these initial observations, to let Holmes conduct his first examination without the interruption of questions or theories. The detective's gaze travelled from the body to the threads to the walls, from the walls to the ceiling, and there, just there, Watson saw the faintest pause, a moment where Holmes's eyes narrowed and his head tilted a fraction of an inch to the left. "The plasterwork," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "18th century restoration, I should think. But that section above the wardrobe, the moulding doesn't quite match." He lifted one long finger and traced a line in the air, mapping something Watson couldn't yet see. "Curious." Before Watson could ask what precisely was curious about Georgian plasterwork, the sound of skirts rustling on the staircase announced the arrival of Mrs. Ashford, the mistress of this elegant Bloomsbury home, and the hostess whose sealed guest room had revealed such an impossible tableau. She appeared at the top of the stairs, slightly breathless, her face pale but composed, a woman in her late 40s who carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to managing both servants and society with equal efficiency. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Watson could detect beneath the words. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I confess I did not know who else to send for. The police will think us mad, or worse, complicit in some dreadful spiritualist hoax." Holmes turned to her with the courteous incline of his head that he reserved for clients who were genuinely distressed rather than merely dramatic. "Mrs. Ashford, I understand the room was locked from the inside when you discovered it?" "Yes. The door was bolted. You can see the bolt there, still drawn. The windows were latched from within. I have the only key to this room on my household ring, and it has not left my possession. The room has been sealed since Tuesday last, when I prepared it for Mr. Carstairs." She gestured toward the suspended figure, her hand trembling slightly. "He was to have stayed the night after our salon gathering, tomorrow evening. When I came up this afternoon to ensure the room was aired and ready, I found—" She could not finish the sentence. "And your guests?" Holmes asked. "You mentioned in your note that you host regular gatherings." "Every Friday evening," Mrs. Ashford confirmed. "A small circle, no more than a dozen. We explore the mysteries of the spirit world, Mr. Holmes. Table-turning, automatic writing, communication with those who have passed beyond the veil. London is alive with such inquiry these days. Surely you have noticed the number of mediums advertising in even the most respectable papers." "I have noticed," Holmes said, with a dryness that suggested his opinion of such advertisements. And Mr. Carstairs was part of your circle. A recent addition. He came to us only 3 weeks ago, introduced by Mrs. Pennington, the wife of the Undersecretary for Colonial Affairs. He claimed to have letters, correspondence that might interest those in political circles. I confess, I found him rather insistent. Not quite a gentleman, if you understand my meaning. Watson understood perfectly. Victorian London was full of such men, hovering at the edges of respectable society, trading in information and influence, seeking entry to drawing-rooms where power resided. Holmes was silent for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the room's interior, and Watson found himself listening to the ambient sounds of the house settling into evening. Below, in the drawing-room, the murmur of voices had faded, replaced by the gentle tick of a mantel clock and the hiss of coal shifting in a grate. Outside, the fog had thickened, muffling the usual sounds of Bloomsbury, the clatter of hansoms on cobblestones, the call of a pie-seller, the distant bell of a church marking the hour. November in London possessed its own peculiar acoustics, as though the city drew a damp grey blanket over itself each evening and whispered rather than spoke. The thread, Watson ventured quietly. It seems too deliberate for chance, too elaborate for haste. Indeed, Holmes agreed, and yet it invites us to believe in haste, in supernatural intervention, in the sudden manifestation of otherworldly forces. Notice, Watson, how the pattern resembles those diagrams you see in the Spiritualist magazine, the sacred geometry supposedly used to summon or communicate with spirits. Notice how the victim is positioned as though crucified or ascending, depending on one's theological inclinations. It is theatre, Doctor. The question is whether it is theatre designed to conceal a method or theatre designed to proclaim a message. Mrs. Ashford drew in a sharp breath. You believe this was staged? That someone created this deliberately to appear supernatural? I believe, Holmes said carefully, that the supernatural rarely employs imported Belgian upholstery thread, and never, in my considerable experience of such matters, ties nautical knots. He glanced at Watson. You noticed them as well. Running bowlines, Watson confirmed, and sheet bends, the sort of work that requires practice. The sort of work, Holmes added, that requires access to this room, time to prepare, and knowledge of when it would be both empty and undisturbed. Mrs. Ashford, your household staff, do any of them have nautical experience? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She paused, frowning slightly as she considered. My late husband was a naval officer, Commander Ashford of Her Majesty's ship Indomitable. He passed 5 years ago. His steward, Jennings, remained in my employ afterward, managing the household. Jennings served with my husband for 20 years. But surely you cannot think. I think nothing yet, Holmes said gently. I am merely collecting facts, as one might collect botanical specimens, to be examined and classified later. Tell me, when was the last time anyone entered this room before today? Tuesday morning. The chambermaid, Mary, aired the linens and laid the fire. She is certain the room was empty and ordinary when she left it. And between Tuesday morning and this afternoon, the door remained locked. Yes, I checked it myself. Tuesday evening, after the maid had finished. The bolt was drawn from the inside. I tested it before I locked the door with my key. Watson saw the problem immediately. But if the bolt was drawn from within and the door locked from without, how could anyone have entered afterward to create this? He gestured at the impossible web. "An excellent question, Doctor," Holmes said, and there was the faintest suggestion of warmth in his voice, the tone he used when Watson had asked precisely the right question at precisely the right moment. One that I suspect has an answer rooted not in the supernatural, but in the architecture of 18th century townhouses and the particular habits of servants who learn not to see what they are not meant to see. He turned to Mrs. Ashford. "I will need to examine the room thoroughly, but not tonight. The light is poor, and I find that crime scenes, if this is indeed a crime, rather than some elaborate suicide, reveal themselves best in the cold examination of morning, rather than the suggestive shadows of evening. Have the door locked and sealed. Allow no one to enter. I shall return at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning with proper instruments and a clearer head." Mrs. Ashford nodded, relief visible in the easing of her shoulders. "Of course, Mr. Holmes, whatever you require. I simply want to understand what has happened under my roof and whether my guests are in any danger." "Your guests," Holmes said, "are in no danger from spirits, Mrs. Ashford. Of that much, at least, I can assure you. Whether they are in danger from each other is a question I cannot yet answer." As they descended the stairs and emerged into the fog-wrapped streets of Bloomsbury, Watson found himself glancing back at the townhouse, at the window of the sealed room, now dark, behind its curtains of fog. The image of that red web, that suspended figure, lingered in his mind like the after-image of a magic lantern slide, vivid and strange and impossible to dismiss. "What did you see, Holmes?" he asked, as they walked toward the corner where a hansom cab waited, its lamps glowing through the murk like watchful eyes. "In the ceiling, I mean. You mentioned the plaster work." Holmes smiled, a quick flash of satisfaction in the gaslit gloom. "I saw what someone hoped I wouldn't see, Watson. Evidence of repair, of alteration, of a ceiling that has been opened and closed and disguised to appear original. But that is a matter for tomorrow's investigation. Tonight, I think we both require our own firesides and the comfort of familiar walls. Mrs. Hudson will be wondering where we've got to, and I find I have a sudden appetite for her lamb stew and the pleasure of a pipe." The cab carried them through Bloomsbury's orderly streets, past the British Museum's massive presence and the quiet dignity of Georgian squares, where gas lamps bloomed against the fog like flowers of light. Watson settled into the leather seat and let the rhythm of hooves on cobblestones work its gentle magic, a kind of metropolitan lullaby that every Londoner knew by heart. The Red Thread Room, he thought, and the case had a name now, a shape in his mind that would grow and develop as Holmes applied his peculiar genius to its unravelling. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. Tonight, the fog held London in its soft grey hands, and somewhere in Bloomsbury a room full of red thread kept its secrets a little while longer. The morning arrived with that peculiar quality of November light that London does so well, pale and silvered, filtered through layers of coal smoke and river mist, until it seemed less like illumination, and more like the memory of brightness. Watson woke to the sound of Mrs. Hudson's measured footsteps on the stairs, the gentle clink of breakfast, things on a tray, and the awareness that Holmes had likely been awake for hours already, his mind working through the puzzle of the Red Thread Room with the relentless precision of an analytical engine processing punch cards. Indeed, when Watson emerged from his bedroom and entered their shared sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street, he found Holmes standing by the window in his dressing gown, a cup of coffee cooling on the sill beside him, his gaze fixed on the street below, as though the passing hansoms and delivery carts might contain some vital clue to yesterday's mystery. The room itself was warm, the fire already crackling in the grate, and the familiar comfort of their lodgings. The cluttered mantelpiece, with its unanswered correspondence pinned by a jackknife, the Persian slipper stuffed with tobacco, the acid-stained deal-topped table, provided a reassuring contrast to the strangeness they had encountered in Bloomsbury. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes said without turning from the window. "Mrs. Hudson has provided an excellent breakfast, and I have taken the liberty of consulting several reference works on Victorian spiritualism while you slept. Did you know that London currently hosts no fewer than 273 registered mediums, and that is merely the ones who advertise in respectable publications? The actual number, if one includes the frauds, the amateurs, and the merely hopeful, likely exceeds 1,000. Watson poured himself coffee from the silver pot and settled into his customary chair. "You believe the case is connected to spiritualism, then?" "I believe," Holmes said, finally turning from the window, "that we are meant to believe it is connected to spiritualism. There is a difference, and that difference is where the truth often hides." He crossed to the breakfast table and began assembling a plate with the distracted efficiency of a man whose appetite was primarily intellectual. Mrs. Ashford's salon is part of a phenomenon that has swept through fashionable London like one of those peculiar crazes that periodically afflict society. Table-turning, spirit photography, automatic writing. It began in earnest after the death of Prince Albert, when grief opened the door to hope, and hope opened the door to charlatans. He settled into his chair and fixed Watson with that intense grey gaze that suggested a lecture was forthcoming. "Consider the social landscape, Watson. The 1890s have brought us electric light, the telephone, underground railways, technologies that would have seemed magical to our grandparents. Is it any wonder that the boundary between science and superstition has become blurred? If one can speak to someone in Edinburgh from a telephone box in London, why should one not speak to the departed through a medium's trance? The logic, while flawed, possesses a certain emotional appeal." Watson spread marmalade on his toast and listened, knowing that Holmes's dissertations often contained insights that would prove vital later. Outside, the sounds of Baker Street waking fully to morning filtered through the windows. The cry of a milk vendor, the rattle of a costuminger's cart, the authoritative tread of a policeman on his rounds. London was a city of layers, Watson had learned, both physical and social, and one could read its character in these small domestic symphonies as clearly as in its grand architecture. Bloomsbury, in particular, has become a haven for such pursuits, Holmes continued. The neighbourhood attracts writers, artists, scholars from the British Museum, and those with sufficient wealth to pursue leisure interests without the obligation of employment. Mrs. Ashford's Friday evening gatherings would be one of dozens occurring within a square mile, circles of ladies and gentlemen seated around mahogany tables in gas-lit drawing-rooms, holding hands, while a medium claims to channel the spirit of someone's departed husband or child. "You sound sceptical," Watson observed. "I am sceptical," Holmes confirmed. "Not of grief, which is real and profound, nor of the human desire to believe that death is not an ending. Those are natural and worthy sentiments. I am sceptical of those who exploit such feelings for profit or influence." I have investigated perhaps a dozen cases involving supposed supernatural phenomena, Watson, and in every single instance, the explanation has been entirely terrestrial. Hidden wires, confederates, knowledge gained through prior research, and then presented as messages from beyond. The methods vary, but the principle remains constant. Misdirection, preparation, and an understanding of what people wish to believe. He paused to sip his coffee, then continued with renewed energy. And yet, the believers multiply. Conan Doyle himself, a man of medicine and literature, has become convinced of spiritualism's validity. The Society for Psychical Research conducts investigations with scientific rigor, seeking evidence of life after death. Magazines devoted to the subject sell thousands of copies. It has become, in short, a cultural movement, and like all movements, it creates both genuine seekers and opportunistic predators. Watson considered this while finishing his toast. He had seen enough of death in Afghanistan and in his subsequent medical practice to understand the desperation that drove people toward any promise of continued connection with lost loved ones. But he had also seen enough of human nature to recognize Holmes's point about exploitation. "And Mr. Carstairs?" Watson asked. "Mrs. Ashford mentioned he claimed to have letters of political interest." "Ah, yes, Mr. Carstairs." Holmes rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he had evidently pinned several notes during his early morning researches. "I sent a telegram to my brother Mycroft before dawn. He responded within the hour. The advantages of having a sibling who effectively is the British government, in all but name. Carstairs was known to the Foreign Office as a man of uncertain employment and certain ambitions. He traded in information, Watson. Letters, documents, whispered conversations overheard in gentlemen's clubs. Not quite blackmail, but adjacent to it. He would acquire something compromising, and then suggest delicately that certain parties might wish to ensure its discretion through financial considerations or social favours. "A parasite," Watson said flatly. "A parasite who found excellent feeding grounds in spiritualist circles," Holmes agreed. "Consider the perfect hunting ground, drawing rooms full of people in vulnerable emotional states, sharing intimate details of their lives and losses, often in the presence of strangers. A man with Carstairs' talents could learn a great deal simply by listening carefully during a séance, then use that knowledge to discover more through conventional investigation. Love letters written by women who are now respectable wives. Financial indiscretions by men who now hold government positions. The past, Watson, is full of secrets that people would prefer remain undiscovered." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. And Mrs. Pennington, the wife of the Undersecretary for Colonial Affairs, introduced him to Mrs. Ashford's circle. Indeed, which raises the interesting question of whether Mrs. Pennington knew what sort of man she was introducing, or whether she herself was being manoeuvred. Mycroft notes that the Undersecretary has been mentioned in certain confidential dispatches as a rising star, likely to be offered a more significant posting within the year. A man with such prospects would be particularly vulnerable to the revelation of indiscretions, whether his own or those of his wife. Holmes returned to his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture Watson recognized as indicative of deep consideration. "We are meant to see a locked room, a supernatural tableau, an impossible crime. But I suspect we are actually looking at a rather different sort of puzzle, one involving motive, opportunity, and the very human desire to silence someone who knows too much. The mantel clock chimed the quarter hour, a gentle reminder that they had an appointment in Bloomsbury at 8 o'clock. Watson rose to dress properly for the day's investigation, but paused at the door to his bedroom. "Holmes, you mentioned last night that you saw evidence of alteration in the ceiling. A hidden opening of some sort." "Possibly," Holmes said, his eyes distant with thought. 18th century townhouses often contain architectural features that later generations forget or conceal. Servants' passages, coal chutes, ventilation systems designed before modern heating. The Ashford house was built in 1785, according to the property records I consulted this morning. It has survived wars, renovations, changes of ownership. Buildings, like people, accumulate secrets. Their walls. An hour later, they stood once more before the Bloomsbury townhouse, its Georgian facade elegant in the morning light, its windows reflecting the pale sky with the blank opacity of mirrors. Mrs. Ashford admitted them personally, her face drawn with what Watson recognized as the particular exhaustion of sleeplessness, rather than mere fatigue. "The room has remained locked," she assured them, as she led them up the carpeted stairs. "I stationed Jennings outside the door all night to ensure no one disturbed it. He reported nothing unusual, though he confessed the house seemed to settle and creak more than customary. Old buildings have their own language, Mr. Holmes." "Indeed they do," Holmes agreed, "and I have learned to be fluent in their dialects." The guest room door stood exactly as they had left it, and when Mrs. Ashford unlocked it and pushed it open, the red thread web remained intact, the body still suspended in its geometric prison. In the morning light, the scene possessed a different quality, less theatrical, more pathetic. The threads were revealed as simply thread, factory-made and purchased, and the body was simply a dead man in evening clothes, held aloft by mundane cordage rather than mystical forces. Holmes entered slowly, his movements precise and measured, and Watson followed, taking care to disturb nothing. The room itself was perhaps 15 feet square, furnished with a 4-poster bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a washstand. The walls were papered in a William Morris pattern of leaves and flowers, now partially obscured by the thread web. The windows, 2 of them, facing the street, were indeed latched from the inside, their brass fittings showing no signs of tampering. "Watson, would you examine the body while I attend to the architecture?" Holmes asked. "Your medical expertise will be more useful than mine for determining time and cause of death." Watson approached the suspended figure carefully, threading his way between the crimson strands. Up close, he could see that the threads had been wrapped around the man's limbs and torso in a pattern that suggested both care and knowledge. The weight was distributed evenly, preventing the body from tipping or falling. Carstairs had been a man of perhaps 50 years, beginning to grey at the temples, with the soft hands and slight paunch of someone whose work was primarily sedentary. The cause of death was not immediately apparent. There were no obvious wounds, no signs of strangulation or violence. Watson checked for lividity and rigor mortis, his physician's training asserting itself despite the bizarre circumstances. "Dead approximately 36 hours, he called to Holmes. "Rigor mortis has passed, lividity is fixed. I would estimate death occurred sometime Wednesday evening or night, but I cannot determine cause without a more thorough examination." "Wednesday evening," Holmes murmured from where he was examining the skirting board near the wardrobe. "After the room was supposedly sealed on Tuesday, but before Mrs. Ashford discovered the tableau yesterday afternoon. A narrow window, Watson, but not impossibly so." Watson completed his preliminary examination and stepped back, his attention now caught by something he had noticed earlier, but not fully registered. The skirting board along the wall beneath the window showed faint indentations, parallel marks perhaps 2 inches apart, as though furniture had been pressed against it and then moved. He knelt to examine them more closely, running his finger along the impressions. "Holmes," he said quietly, "the furniture has been rearranged. These marks suggest something. The desk, perhaps, or a chair, was positioned here against the wall, then moved to its current location." Holmes crossed the room in 3 long strides and crouched beside Watson, his magnifying glass appearing in his hand as though summoned by conjury. "Excellent observation, Doctor. Yes, these are definitely drag marks, and relatively recent. The dust has not yet settled evenly over them. And here," he pointed to a corresponding set of marks near the writing desk's current position, "we have evidence of where the furniture was moved from. Someone rearranged this room, Watson, either before or after creating the thread web." "But why?" Watson asked. "That," Holmes said, rising and brushing dust from his knees, "is the question that will unlock this entire puzzle. Why move furniture in a locked room where you are supposedly staging a supernatural tableau? Unless—" He turned slowly, his gaze moving across the room with renewed intensity. "Unless the furniture was moved to conceal evidence of how you entered and exited the room without using the door or windows." He strode to the wardrobe and pulled it away from the wall with surprising strength, revealing the wallpaper behind it. And there, just visible in the morning light, a faint rectangular seam where the paper had been cut and repasted, almost, but not quite, invisibly. "Mrs. Ashford," Holmes called toward the doorway where she waited. "Who papered this room, and when?" "The room was redecorated 5 years ago," she replied, entering cautiously. "After my husband's death. I wanted the house to feel less like a ship captain's quarters and more like a home. But that section of wall," she peered at the seam Holmes had discovered, "that appears to have been touched more recently. I did not authorize any repairs." Holmes produced a penknife from his pocket and carefully worked it along the seam, peeling back a section of wallpaper to reveal not plaster beneath, but wood, painted to match the wall, but unmistakably a panel, and one that showed signs of recent use. The paint along its edges was scuffed, suggesting it had been opened and closed multiple times. "A priest's hole," Watson breathed, "or a servant's passage." "Precisely," Holmes said with evident satisfaction, "and one that leads, if I am not mistaken, directly to the attic space above this ceiling. The alteration I noticed in the plasterwork yesterday corresponds exactly to this location. Someone, Watson, has been using the architecture of this house for purposes Mrs. Ashford never intended." He turned to their hostess. "I will need to interview your staff, particularly Jennings and the chambermaid Mary, and I will need access to your attic and any plans or records of the house's original construction. This crime, and I am now certain it is a crime rather than a suicide, depended on intimate knowledge of this building's hidden spaces." Mrs. Ashford nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Whatever you require, Mr. Holmes, I want to understand what has happened under my roof." As Watson stood in that morning-lit room, surrounded by red thread and the evidence of careful staging, he felt the familiar sensation of a case beginning to cohere, puzzle pieces finding their places, the fog of confusion starting to lift. Outside, Bloomsbury continued its genteel morning routine, unaware that within these elegant walls someone had woven murder and misdirection into a web designed to deceive. But Holmes, Watson knew, was already pulling at the threads. Soon enough, the whole construction would unravel. The walk from Bloomsbury to Clerkenwell took them through the layered geography of London's morning, each neighbourhood revealing its own particular character as the city shook off the night's fog and settled into the business of the day. Holmes set a brisk pace, his walking stick tapping a rhythm on the pavement that suggested both urgency and purpose, while Watson matched his stride, grateful for the movement after the close atmosphere of the sealed guest room. They passed through streets where the architecture itself told stories, Georgian terraces giving way to older, more cramped constructions, the orderly squares of professional London yielding to the tighter weave of commercial districts, where workshops and warehouses crowded against one another like neighbours at a market stall. The air changed too, acquiring the particular sense of industry. Dye works and tanneries, coal smoke and metal, the yeasty warmth of bakeries and the sharp tang of printing ink from the newspaper offices that clustered in certain streets like mushrooms after rain. Clerkenwell had been, for centuries, the home of craftsmen, clockmakers and jewellers, instrument makers and precision engineers, the sort of artisans whose work required both skill and patience. More recently, it had added textile merchants to its population, men who traded in the fabrics and threads that fed London's insatiable appetite for fashion, upholstery, theatrical costumes, and the 1,000 other applications that required quality materials. Holmes had consulted his mental catalogue of the city's specialized traders during breakfast, and identified 3 establishments that dealt in the sort of thread they sought. Imported, high quality, suitable for both upholstery and decorative purposes. The first 2 shops yielded nothing of interest. The proprietors were polite, but unhelpful, their ledgers showing no unusual purchases of red silk thread in recent weeks, their memories containing no recollection of customers matching the vague descriptions Holmes provided. But the 3rd establishment, tucked into a narrow street near the Clerkenwell Green, proved more fruitful. The shop was called Threadneedle and Sons, which Watson privately thought was almost too perfect a name, suggesting either a tradesman's sense of humour or a fortunate ancestral surname. The proprietor, Mr. Cornelius Threadneedle, was a man in his 60s, with the careful hands and precise manner of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating quality by touch and sight. His shop was a marvel of organisation, spools and skeins arranged by colour and weight, drawers labelled in copperplate script, the whole space smelling pleasantly of cotton and wool with undernotes of the beeswax used to treat certain threads. "Gentlemen," he greeted them as they entered, his eyes taking in Holmes's sharp-featured intensity, and Watson's military bearing with the practised assessment of a man accustomed to reading customers. "How may I assist you? We have recently received an excellent shipment of Egyptian cotton, if you are in need of durable thread for garments, or perhaps you seek something more specialized." Holmes produced a small evidence bag from his coat pocket, one of several he carried habitually, containing the strand of red thread that Watson had caught on his cuff the previous evening. "I am interested," he said, In identifying the source of this particular thread, it appears to be silk, imported, dyed a specific shade of crimson, and treated with what I believe to be beeswax. Mr. Threadneedle's eyes lit with professional interest. He accepted the bag carefully, removed the thread, and carried it to his workbench, where a large magnifying glass on a brass stand provided excellent illumination and magnification. For several minutes he examined the fibre in silence, occasionally making small sounds of recognition or satisfaction. "Belgian," he said finally, looking up with the confidence of an expert rendering judgment. "From the looms outside Bruges. The twist is characteristic. You see how the fibres spiral in a very specific ratio. That is achieved by a particular type of spindle that the Belgian craftsmen favour. The dye is cochineal based, which gives it this deep, stable red that will not fade with light or washing. And yes, it has been drawn through beeswax to give it body and prevent fraying during use. This is upholstery-grade thread, sir, not meant for delicate needlework, but for projects requiring strength and durability." Holmes leaned forward, his expression intent. "Upholstery or theatrical work?" "Either," Mr. Threadneedle confirmed. "The theatres purchase this quality for curtains and backdrops that must hang for months without deterioration. Upholsterers use it for furniture that will receive hard use, drawing-room sofas, dining chairs, the sort of pieces that must withstand years of sitting and wear. It is not cheap, mind you. This particular quality runs about 3 shillings per 100 yards. "Have you sold any quantity of this thread in recent weeks?" Holmes asked. "Say, within the past month." Mr. Threadneedle returned to his counter and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat entries recording sales and purchases. He ran his finger down the columns, his lips moving slightly as he calculated. "I sold 500 yards of this exact thread 3 weeks ago, October 15th, to be precise. That would be enough to create a substantial theatrical installation or to reupholster several pieces of furniture, depending on the complexity of the work." "And the purchaser?" Holmes's voice remained casual, but Watson could hear the sharp attention beneath the surface. "A woman," Mr. Threadneedle said, consulting his notes. "She gave her name as Miss Sarah Collins, and claimed to be the assistant to a Mrs. Ashford of Bloomsbury. Said her mistress was redecorating a guest room and required thread for new upholstery and curtains. She paid in cash, £2, 3 shillings for the thread, and a quantity of needles and beeswax besides." Watson saw Holmes's eyes narrow infinitesimally. "Can you describe this Miss Collins?" Mr. Threadneedle closed his eyes, summoning memory. 30 years of age, perhaps, or slightly younger, plainly dressed in grey wool, a servant's clothing, respectable but not fashionable, brown hair under a modest bonnet, spoke with an educated accent, not broad Cockney, but not upper class either. The sort of voice you hear from ladies' maids who have been taught to speak properly. She seemed knowledgeable about thread, asked intelligent questions about durability and colour fastness. I assumed she had experience in household management. "And you had no reason to doubt her story?" "None whatsoever. Ladies are constantly redecorating, sir, and they frequently send their assistants to make purchases. I see such transactions daily. The only reason I remember this particular one is the quantity of thread. 500 yards is substantial, and this quality is expensive enough that the transaction stood out in my memory." Holmes produced a small notebook and recorded the details with quick precise strokes. If I were to bring photographs for your examination, would you be able to identify Miss Collins should you see her again? I believe so, Mr. Threadneedle said. I have a merchant's memory for faces. It serves me well in business to remember customers and their preferences. After securing a promise that Mr. Threadneedle would send word immediately, should anyone attempt to purchase more of the same thread, Holmes and Watson emerged back into the Clerkenwell Street. The morning had advanced while they were inside, and the neighbourhood was now fully awake. Delivery carts rattling past, apprentices hurrying on errands, the sound of machinery from workshops where craftsmen bent to their specialised labours. "Sarah Collins does not exist," Holmes said, as they began walking back toward central London. "Or rather, she exists only as a fiction created for the purpose of purchasing materials without revealing the true buyer's identity. Mrs. Ashford confirmed she has no assistant by that name, and her household staff consists of Jennings the steward, Mary the chambermaid, a cook, and a daily cleaning woman. No one matching Mr. Threadneedle's description." "Then someone posed as Mrs. Ashford's assistant," Watson said. "Someone who knew enough about the household to make the story plausible, and who had sufficient funds to make a substantial cash purchase." "Precisely. And someone who knew, 3 weeks in advance, that they would need 500 yards of distinctive crimson thread for purposes Mrs. Ashford had not authorized." Holmes's walking stick punctuated his thoughts with sharp taps. "This was not an impulsive crime, Watson. This was planned methodically, with attention to detail and an understanding of what materials would be required." They had reached the edge of Clerkenwell now, where the streets began their transition back toward the more prosperous districts. Holmes paused at a corner where a coffee stall was doing brisk business, and purchased 2 cups of the strong, sweet brew that London's working people favoured. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, warming their hands on the earthenware cups, watching the city flow past with its endless variety of faces and purposes. "The thread pattern in that room," Watson said, organising his thoughts aloud, "resembled occult diagrams, but the knots were nautical, practical. The staging suggests spiritualism, but the method suggests someone with sailing experience. Mrs. Ashford's late husband was a naval officer, and his steward Jennings served with him for 20 years. And yet," Holmes mused, "Jennings is an elderly man who has been with the household for 5 years since Commander Ashford's death. If he were going to commit murder under Mrs. Ashford's roof, would he do so in a manner that practically announced his nautical expertise? It seems remarkably indiscreet." "Unless he wanted to be discovered," Watson suggested. "Or unless there are others with sailing knowledge connected to the household." "Commander Ashford served on the Indomitable," Holmes said. "A ship with a crew of several hundred men, any number of whom might have maintained connections with their former officer's household after his death. Sailors are loyal to their commanders, Watson. They form bonds that survive retirement and even death. It would not be unusual for former crew members to visit, to receive small assistances, to remain peripherally connected to the household that once represented authority and security." A thought struck Watson. "Or for their relatives, wives, daughters, nieces, to seek employment or assistance from the widow of their former commander." Holmes smiled, that quick flash of satisfaction that indicated Watson had followed the reasoning correctly. "Indeed, a woman with sailing knowledge, gained perhaps through family, rather than personal service. Someone close enough to the household to know its routines, to understand when rooms would be empty, to have access to keys or knowledge of the building's hidden passages. Someone who could pose convincingly as a household assistant because she understood the role from observation or experience. The coffee stall vendor was watching them with the mild curiosity of a man accustomed to London's eccentricities, but still occasionally intrigued by them. Holmes finished his coffee, returned the cup with a nod of thanks, and resumed walking. "This afternoon," he said, "we will return to Bloomsbury and interview Jennings properly. I want to know everyone who has visited the Ashford household in the past month, every former crew member who maintains contact, every relative or connection who might have knowledge of both the building's architecture and the skills required to tie nautical knots. The thread has given us method and premeditation. Now we need to identify the hand that wove the web." Behind them, Clerkenwell settled into its midday rhythm, the looms and workshops producing the materials that London required to maintain its position as the world's greatest city. Somewhere in those buildings, threads were being spun and dyed, prepared for purposes both mundane and extraordinary. One such thread had already served its purpose in a Bloomsbury guest room. Now it would serve another, leading Holmes and Watson toward the truth that someone had worked so carefully to conceal. The afternoon found them back in Bloomsbury, seated in Mrs. Ashford's drawing-room, while grey light filtered through lace curtains and a coal fire whispered gently in the grate. The room spoke of comfortable widowhood, maritime paintings on the walls showing ships under full sail, a telescope mounted on a brass stand near the window, a ship's chronometer in a polished wooden case on the mantelpiece. Commander Ashford's presence lingered here 5 years after his death, preserved in the objects that had meant something to him, and now meant something to his widow as remembrances. Jennings entered with the measured dignity of a man who had spent decades in service, first to the Royal Navy and then to this household. He was perhaps 70 years old, straight-backed despite his age, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years at sea before settling into the calmer waters of domestic management. His hands, Watson noticed, were large and capable, the sort of hands that could splice rope or polish brass with equal competence. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" Sam's voice carried the accent of Portsmouth, softened but not erased by years in London. "Please, sit." Holmes gestured to a chair. "I understand you served with Commander Ashford for 20 years aboard the Indomitable." 22 years, sir," Jennings corrected, with quiet pride. "From the time I was 17 until the commander's retirement. I was his personal steward, saw to his cabin, his uniforms, his correspondence. When he passed, Mrs. Ashford was kind enough to keep me on. This house runs like a ship, in its way, and I know how the commander would have wanted things maintained." Holmes steepled his fingers, his grey eyes thoughtful. "The red thread web in the guest room. Someone created it, using sailors' knots. Running bowlines, sheet bends, the sort of work taught in the Navy. Are you familiar with such knots?" "Every sailor knows them, sir. You learn them as a boy, or you don't survive. Lines that must hold in a storm, rigging that must bear the weight of canvas in a gale. There's no room for decorative knots at sea. Everything must be practical, strong, reliable." Jennings's hands moved unconsciously as he spoke, fingers tracing patterns in the air as though feeling rope that wasn't there. "Could you tie such knots now?" "With my eyes closed, sir, even at my age. Some things become part of you, like walking or breathing. But I did not create that web, Mr. Holmes. I've no reason to harm anyone, and certainly no reason to do so under Mrs. Ashford's roof after all her kindness to me." Watson watched the old steward's face carefully, using his physician's training to read truth and deception. He saw nothing but genuine puzzlement and concern, the expression of a man whose ordered world had been disrupted by something he could not understand. "I believe you," Holmes said simply. "But I also believe someone with nautical knowledge created that installation. You mentioned the house runs like a ship. Do you maintain connections with other men who served aboard the Indomitable, former crew members who might visit or correspond?" Jennings considered this. "There are a few, sir. Sailors form bonds that last. When the Indomitable was decommissioned in '89, most of the crew scattered to other postings or to civilian life, but some kept in touch. Old Tom Brackett, the boatswain's mate, he sends a Christmas card each year from Southampton. Jack Morrison, who was a midshipman under the commander, now captains a merchant vessel on the India Run. And there's young Billy Hewitt, who lost an arm at Zanzibar and receives a small pension that Mrs. Ashford continues to supplement out of kindness." "Does Billy Hewitt visit the household?" "Occasionally, sir. Perhaps once a month. He comes to thank Mrs. Ashford for her generosity and to share news. He's taken up carving with his remaining hand, makes ship models that are quite remarkable." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And the women? Wives, daughters, sisters of crew members who might have learned nautical skills through family connection?" Something shifted in Jennings's expression. Not guilt, but recognition, as though Holmes had touched upon something the steward had not previously considered significant. "There is Miss Sarah Hewitt, Billy's elder sister. She practically raised him after their mother died, before he went to sea. She visited the house perhaps 6 weeks ago, seeking employment. Said she had experience in household management and wondered if Mrs. Ashford might know of any positions available among her acquaintances." Watson saw Holmes's posture sharpen with interest, though his voice remained conversational. "And did Mrs. Ashford assist her?" "Mrs. Ashford was away in Bath, visiting her sister. I received Miss Hewitt myself, took her details, said I would pass them along when the mistress returned. She seemed a respectable woman, well-spoken, plainly but neatly dressed. I gave her tea in the kitchen, and we spoke for perhaps an hour about Billy, about the old, indomitable days, about life in the Navy. She was curious about the house, I remember, asked about its history, admired the architecture, mentioned that her father had been a carpenter, and she'd learned to appreciate good construction." "Did you show her the house?" Holmes asked. Jennings paused, memory clearly working. "I showed her the drawing room and the morning room, yes. She admired the commander's paintings and the chronometer. I may have mentioned that we kept certain rooms sealed when not in use. The guest room, for instance, which was only opened for visitors. And I suppose I might have mentioned that the house was old, built in the previous century, with the sort of architectural features that modern houses lack." "Hidden passages?" Holmes suggested gently. "Servants' stairs?" "I did not give her a tour of the servants' quarters, sir, if that's what you're asking. But I may have mentioned, in passing, that old houses often contain surprises, concealed. Doorways, storage spaces built into walls, the sort of things that made sense when the house was constructed, but that later generations forget about." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, and Watson could read the thought clearly. Miss Sarah Hewitt, sister of a former crew member, visiting when Mrs. Ashford was away, learning about the house's architecture, curious and observant. Sarah Collins, the fictitious assistant who purchased 500 yards of red thread 3 weeks ago. The names were different, but the description Mr. Threadneedle had provided matched precisely. A woman of about 30, plainly dressed, well-spoken, knowledgeable. "Where does Miss Hewitt live?" Holmes asked. "She gave an address in Southwark, near the docks. But I don't know if she still resides there. That was 6 weeks ago, and she may have found employment elsewhere since then." Holmes stood, clearly satisfied that he had extracted the essential information. "Thank you, Jennings. You have been most helpful. One final question. Did Miss Hewitt have brown hair and wear it under a modest bonnet?" "Yes, sir. Brown hair going slightly grey at the temples, neat and tidy under a plain bonnet. She had capable hands, I remember. The sort of hands that knew work." After Jennings had left, Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the Bloomsbury Street, where evening was beginning to gather, the gas lamps being lit one by the lamplighter making his rounds. Watson could see his friend's mind working through the connections, assembling the puzzle pieces into a coherent picture. "We must visit the Thames," Holmes said abruptly. "I want to speak with someone who can tell us precisely what skills Miss Sarah Hewitt might have learned from growing up in a sailing family. And I want to understand the full extent of what those nautical knots in the guest room represent. Not merely that they are sailors' work, but what they tell us about the person who tied them. The cab ride to the Thames. Docks took them through the evening transformation of London, from the genteel streets of Bloomsbury, through the increasingly commercial districts, until they reached the river itself. That great artery of empire, where ships from every corner of the globe brought their cargoes and their stories. The air here tasted of salt and tar, of spices from distant ports and the ever-present coal smoke that hung over the city like a grey blessing. Holmes directed the cab to a particular section of the docks where older vessels moored, the sort of ships that had seen decades of service, and now ended their days in less glamorous work, cargo barges and fishing boats, vessels that hauled coal or ferried passengers across the river. Here, among the creaking timbers and the lap of dark water against pilings, they found the man Holmes sought. His name was Abraham Wickham, and he was ancient beyond reckoning, a man who claimed to have gone to sea before Victoria took the throne, and who now spent his days on a permanently moored barge, mending nets and rope for anyone who would pay him a few pence for his expertise. His face was carved by wind and sun into a map of wrinkles, and his hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, still moved with the muscle memory of decades spent working with cordage. "Mr. Wickham," Holmes began, after they had been introduced by the harbour master who knew everyone along this stretch of river, "I need your expertise regarding knots. Specifically, I need to understand what sailors' knots can tell us about the person who tied them." The old man gestured for them to sit on upturned crates, and Watson settled carefully, conscious of the barge's gentle rocking beneath them. Around them, the Thames conducted its evening symphony. The creak of ships, the cry of gulls, the distant sound of a steam whistle, the voices of sailors calling to one another in 6 languages. "Show me," Wickham said simply. Holmes produced the photographs he had taken that morning of the thread web, detailed images showing the knots where threads joined at walls and furniture. Wickham studied them for long minutes, occasionally grunting or making small sounds of recognition. Finally, he looked up, his eyes still sharp despite his age. "This is Navy work," he said with certainty. "Not merchant marine, not fishing fleet. Royal Navy, and probably from someone who learned their knots properly, not just picked them up casual-like. See here?" He pointed to one knot. "This is a running bowline tied exactly as they teach it at Portsmouth. Perfect form, nothing sloppy or improvised. And here, this sheet bend. It's got the extra turn that you only learn if someone shows you proper, the way they do in training." "Could a woman tie these knots?" Watson asked. Wickham's weathered face creased in something that might have been a smile. "You'd be surprised what women can do, Doctor. I've known sailmakers' daughters who could splice rope better than most sailors. If a girl grows up watching her father or brother work with cordage, if she's got clever hands and a mind for patterns, there's no reason she couldn't learn. Knots aren't about strength. They're about understanding, about knowing which knot serves which purpose, about muscle memory that comes from practice." "And these knots," Holmes said, "they suggest someone who learned from a Navy man, not someone self-taught from books." "Books can teach you the basics," Wickham allowed, "but this level of precision, this perfect form, that comes from having someone stand over you and make you do it again and again until you get it right. This person learned from a sailor, Mr. Holmes, learned well and practiced until it became second nature." Holmes nodded slowly, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Thank you, Mr. Wickham. You have confirmed what I suspected." As they made their way back through the docks toward the street, where they might find a cab, Watson felt the pieces continuing to align in his mind. Sarah Hewitt, raised by a sailing family, sister to a Navy man, possibly taught knots by her father, the carpenter, or her brother before he went to sea. Sarah Collins, the fictitious purchaser of thread. A woman with access to the Ashford household's secrets, knowledge of its architecture, and the skills necessary to create an elaborate locked-room illusion using nautical techniques. "But why?" Watson asked, as they finally found a cab and settled into its leather interior for the journey back to Baker Street. What was her motive for killing Carstairs? "Ah," Holmes said, his eyes distant with thought, as the cab rattled through evening streets now fully dark, the gas lamps creating pools of amber light that the fog turned soft and dreamlike. "That, Watson, is tomorrow's question. Tonight we have established method and opportunity. Tomorrow we must uncover motive, and I suspect when we do, we will find that Carstairs' trade in secrets finally led him to a secret that someone was willing to kill to protect." The cab carried them through London's layered darkness, past windows glowing with firelight and lamplight, past lives being lived in countless variations behind those walls. Somewhere in Suffolk, if she had not already fled, Sarah Hewitt was perhaps sitting by her own fire, unaware that Holmes had traced the thread, literal and figurative, back to her capable, knot-tying hands. But soon enough, Watson knew, they would find her. And then the red thread room would yield its final secrets. The journey to Suffolk took them across the Thames by way of Westminster Bridge, the river flowing dark and swollen beneath them, its surface stippled by rain that showed no signs of relenting. London, in November, possessed a particular melancholy beauty, the city wrapped in grey wool, softened and muted, its harsh edges blurred by mist and drizzle, until even the grimiest streets acquired a kind of watercolour charm. Watson watched the water below, thought about tides, about currents both literal and metaphorical, about how lives could be pulled inexorably toward moments of crisis as surely as the Thames pulled toward the sea. Holmes had spent the cab ride reviewing documents that Mrs. Ashford had provided. Billy Hewitt's service record, letters of commendation, and crucially, a thick file of correspondence relating to an incident at Zanzibar in 1888. Watson could see his friend's eyes moving rapidly across the pages, that extraordinary mind processing information at speeds that still amazed the doctor even after years of acquaintance. Billy Hewitt was 19 when he lost his arm, Holmes said, without looking up from the papers. A shell explosion during a naval engagement with Arab slave traders operating along the coast. He was cited for bravery, pulled 3 wounded shipmates to safety before the ammunition stores exploded. But there was an inquiry afterward, Watson. Questions were raised about whether proper safety protocols had been followed, whether the munitions had been stored correctly, whether someone's negligence had contributed to the severity of the explosion. And Carstairs was involved in this inquiry? Watson asked. Not directly, but he appears to have acquired letters written by one of the officers aboard, letters to his wife in which he expressed concerns about command decisions, about corners being cut to save money, about warnings ignored. The sort of correspondence that, if made public, could destroy reputations and end careers, particularly now that several of those officers have advanced to positions of considerable authority within the Admiralty. Holmes finally looked up, his grey eyes thoughtful. And here is where the personal and the political intersect, Watson. Billy Hewitt's injury resulted in a pension that was initially quite generous, but which was later reduced following the inquiry's conclusions. The official finding was that proper protocols had been followed, and that the explosion was simply the tragic cost of naval warfare. Billy's pension was recalculated accordingly, reduced to the standard rate for injury rather than the enhanced rate for injury resulting from service beyond the call of duty. And Sarah Hewitt believed Carstairs' letters could prove otherwise, Watson said, understanding dawning. Could show that negligence had cost her brother his arm and his livelihood. More than that, Holmes said quietly, could restore his honour and his pension. Sarah wrote to the Admiralty 3 times in the past year, requesting a review of her brother's case. She was politely, but firmly rebuffed. Then Carstairs appears in Mrs. Ashford's salon, boasting of possessing letters that touch on the Zanzibar incident, and Sarah sees an opportunity, or perhaps a threat. The cab had crossed the bridge now, and entered Southwark, where the streets narrowed and the buildings pressed closer together, where the prosperity of Westminster and the city gave way to the working districts that housed dock workers and factory labourers, seamstresses and clerks, the vast machinery of people whose labour kept London functioning, but who remained largely invisible to those they served. The address Jennings had provided led them to a modest lodging-house on a street that smelled of the river and of the tanneries that operated nearby. The landlady who answered Holmes's knock was a stout woman in her 50s, with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating potential tenants for their likelihood of paying rent and causing minimal trouble. Yes, she confirmed. Miss Sarah Hewitt had lodged here for the past 8 months, along with her brother, Billy. Quiet tenants, paid promptly, kept their rooms tidy. But Miss Hewitt had been away for the past 3 days, said she had employment opportunities to investigate in the north. "And Mr. Hewitt?" Holmes asked. "Is he at home?" "Workshop around back," the landlady said. jerking her thumb toward a narrow alley beside the house. Spends his days carving, makes beautiful ship models, does Billy, all with one hand, sells them sometimes to the chandlers down by the docks. They found Billy Hewitt in a space that was part workshop and part sanctuary, a small room with good northern light filtering through rain-streaked windows, the air sharp with the scent of wood shavings and linseed oil. He was perhaps 27 years old, thin and wiry, his left sleeve pinned up at the shoulder where his arm ended. But his remaining hand moved with remarkable precision as he worked on a model of a 3-masted ship, the sort of exquisite miniature that captured not merely the form, but the spirit of the original. He looked up as they entered, and Watson saw intelligence in his face along with wariness, the expression of someone who has learned to be cautious about strangers and their intentions. "Mr. Hewitt," Holmes began gently, "my name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are investigating a death that occurred in Mrs. Ashford's home, a man named Carstairs. I believe your sister Sarah may have information relevant to our inquiry." Billy Hewitt's hand stilled on the model ship. For a long moment he said nothing, and the only sound was the rain drumming on the workshop roof and the distant cry of gulls from the river. "She did it for me," he said finally, his voice carrying the flat resignation of someone who's been expecting this moment, and is almost relieved it has arrived. "Whatever happened, whatever she did, it was to protect me, or to get justice for me. Sarah has spent her whole life protecting me, Mr. Holmes. When our mother died, when I went to sea, when I came back broken, she was always there, always fighting for me." Holmes pulled up a stool and sat, bringing himself to Billy's eye level rather than towering over him. Watson recognized this as Holmes's interview technique for witnesses. He believed to be fundamentally honest, create equality, encourage confession through compassion rather than confrontation. "Tell me about Zanzibar," Holmes said quietly. "Tell me what really happened." And Billy did, the words coming slowly at first, and then faster, as though a dam had broken. He spoke of the Indomitable's engagement with slave traders, of the shells that fell on the deck, of the moment when he realized the munitions store had been placed too close to the gun positions despite his warnings to the gunnery officer. He spoke of the explosion, of waking in the ship's surgery to find his arm gone, of the pain and the laudanum and the slow realization that his life as a sailor was over. "They said proper protocols were followed," Billy said bitterly. "They said I was imagining things because of the shock and the pain. But I know what I saw, Mr. Holmes. I know that munitions were stored where they shouldn't have been because it was more convenient for the gun crews, and I know that I reported it to Lieutenant Pemberton, and was told not to make trouble. And when the inquiry happened, Lieutenant Pemberton testified that no such concerns had been raised. And who were they going to believe? An officer and gentleman, or a common sailor? And your pension was reduced," Holmes said. "Cut by more than half. Sarah tried to fight it, wrote letters, went to offices, was turned away every time. She works as a seamstress, Mr. Holmes, sewing fancy dresses for ladies who pay her a pittance and treat her like she's invisible. Every shilling she earns goes toward keeping us housed and fed and making up what I lost when they decided my arm wasn't worth what they'd promised." Watson felt anger rising in his chest, the same anger he'd felt during his own military service, when he saw good men betrayed by bureaucratic indifference, or self-serving officers who prioritize their careers over the welfare of those under their command. Carstairs had letters, Holmes said. Letters from Lieutenant Pemberton to his wife, written during the voyage, expressing concerns about safety. Did Sarah know about these letters? Billy's face twisted. Carstairs came here, Mr. Holmes. Came to this workshop 3 weeks ago, all friendly and concerned. Said he'd heard about my case. Said he had evidence that could help. Said he wanted to do the right thing. And I believed him. God help me, I believed him. I told him everything, showed him Sarah's correspondence with the Admiralty, explained how we'd been fighting for years to get justice. And then? Holmes prompted gently. Then he told me his price. Said he'd give me the letters for £500. Money we don't have, could never have. Said if I couldn't pay, he'd sell them to Lieutenant Pemberton instead, who would certainly pay to keep them buried. £500, or watch the proof of your innocence disappear forever. That was his offer. Billy's remaining hand clenched into a fist. I told Sarah I shouldn't have, but I was so angry, so helpless. I told her, and I saw something change in her face. She got very quiet, very calm, said she would handle it, that I shouldn't worry. And then, 3 days ago, she left, said she had employment opportunities to investigate. The workshop fell silent, except for the rain. Watson could see the pieces falling into their final arrangement. Sarah Hewitt, desperate and furious, using the skills and knowledge she possessed to create an opportunity for justice, or, perhaps, revenge. The thread purchased under a false name. The access to Mrs. Ashford's house gained through legitimate inquiry. The knowledge of the hidden ceiling hatch learned from her carpenter father or discovered through careful exploration. The nautical skills taught by her brother, or picked up through a lifetime around sailors. The Friday Salon, Holmes said. Mrs. Ashford hosts them weekly. Sarah would have known Carstairs would attend. He had been coming for 3 weeks, insinuating himself into the circle. She lured him to the house early, perhaps with a promise to discuss payment, perhaps with a claim that she had found the money. She killed him in the attic, where his body could be hidden, then waited for the perfect moment, the piano recital that would mask any sounds from above. The performance was announced in advance, Watson added, understanding. Mrs. Ashford mentioned it in her notes, a special recital by a visiting pianist. Sarah would have known exactly when it would occur and how long it would last. Billy Hewitt's face had gone pale. Is Carstairs truly dead? I am afraid so, Holmes confirmed. Your sister created an elaborate locked-room mystery designed to suggest supernatural agency rather than human hands. She used every skill at her disposal to stage a scene that would baffle investigation, and perhaps even avoid being classified as murder at all. It was, in its way, a remarkable piece of theatre. What will happen to her? Billy asked, and his voice cracked with anguish. Holmes stood, his expression grave, but not without sympathy. That depends on several factors, Mr. Hewitt. Where she is, whether she can be found, what evidence can be proven in a court of law. But I will tell you this. I understand why she did what she did, even if I cannot condone her method. Carstairs was a parasite who fed on human misery, and the system that reduced your pension was unjust. Understanding motive does not excuse murder, but it does provide context. As they left the workshop and walked back through Southwark's rain-soaked streets, Watson found himself thinking about justice and mercy, about the difference between what is legal and what is right, about the impossible choices that desperate people make when all legitimate avenues have been exhausted. "Will you pursue her, Holmes?" he asked, as they hailed a cab back toward central London. Holmes was silent for a long moment, watching the rain bead on the cab window. "I will do what I must, Watson," he said, finally. "But I will do it with full knowledge that the true crime here was committed long before Sarah Hewitt entered Mrs. Ashford's attic." The cab carried them through the grey afternoon, and somewhere ahead lay the conclusion of the Red Thread Room case. Justice of one kind or another, mercy if it could be found, and the recognition that sometimes the most elaborate mysteries conceal the simplest and most human of truths. The evening gathered early, as November evenings do in London, pulling darkness down over the city like a curtain falling at the end of a performance. By the time Holmes and Watson returned to Mrs. Ashford's Bloomsbury residence, the gas lamps were already lit along the street, their flames creating soft halos in the mist that had replaced the rain. The house itself glowed from within, windows golden against the grey facade, and Watson could see shadows moving behind the lace curtains, guests assembling for what they believed would be merely another salon, gathering, unaware that they were about to witness the final act of a tragedy that had been playing out beneath their notice. Mrs. Ashford met them at the door, her face pale but composed. "Everyone is here, Mr. Holmes, as you requested. Mrs. Pennington and her husband, the Under-Secretary, the medium, Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Thornton, and several other regular attendees. They believe we are gathering to discuss the unfortunate incident and to decide whether the Friday salons should continue. I have not told them the true purpose of this evening." "That is well," Holmes said, removing his coat and hat. "And Jennings?" "Upstairs in the guest room, preparing it as you instructed. Mr. Holmes, are you certain about this course of action? If Miss Hewitt is truly responsible, should we not simply summon the police and have her arrested?" Holmes's expression was thoughtful, almost sad. "I am certain that the truth must be revealed, Mrs. Ashford. What happens afterward? That is a question that involves not merely law but justice, and the two are not always synonymous. Please give me a few more minutes before bringing your guests upstairs." They climbed to the guest room, where Jennings had indeed prepared it according to Holmes's specific instructions. The red thread web had been carefully preserved, the body removed, but everything else left precisely as it had been discovered. Additional gas lamps had been brought in, flooding the space with light that made the crimson threads glow like arterial blood suspended in amber. The effect was both beautiful and unsettling. A spider's web spun from silk instead of gossamer, geometric and purposeful rather than organic. Watson positioned himself near the window, watching as the guests assembled in the hallway outside, their voices a soft murmur of curiosity and concern. He recognized Mrs. Pennington from Holmes's description, a handsome woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed, with the particular poise of someone accustomed to navigating both social and political circles. Her husband, the Under-Secretary, was a tall man with grey, threading his dark hair, and the careful expression of someone whose words are always being weighed for their political implications. But it was the figure standing slightly apart from the others that caught Watson's attention. A woman in a plain grey dress with brown hair going to silver at the temples, her face composed, but her hands clasped tightly together in a way that suggested she was holding herself very still through force of will. Sarah Hewitt. She had returned, just as Holmes had predicted she would, unable to stay away from the scene of her carefully constructed tableau, drawn back by the same impulse that brings criminals to watch their handiwork or attend the funerals of their victims. Holmes had sent her a telegram that afternoon. Watson knew. A brief message claiming to be from Billy, saying he needed her urgently, giving this address and time. She had come, whether out of concern for her brother or resignation that her flight could only be temporary, Watson could not say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying clearly through the room as the guests filed in and arranged themselves around the perimeter, careful not to disturb the threadweb. "Thank you for gathering this evening. I know you have questions about Mr. Carstairs' death, about the extraordinary circumstances under which he was discovered, about what this means for the safety of Mrs. Ashford's household and the continuation of your Friday gatherings. I hope to answer all of those questions tonight, and in doing so, to demonstrate that while the scene before you suggests supernatural intervention, the truth is entirely terrestrial, and, in its way, far more tragic than any ghostly manifestation could be." He moved to stand beside the web, his lean figure dramatic in the gaslight, and Watson was reminded once again of his friend's theatrical gifts, his ability to command attention and construct narrative with the skill of a master storyteller. "This room was locked from the inside," Holmes continued. "The windows were latched, the door was bolted, and yet Mr. Carstairs was found suspended in this elaborate web of red thread, positioned as though by invisible hands in a pattern that suggests occult ritual and spiritual intervention. Many of you, I know, believe in the reality of the spirit world, in the possibility of communication between the living and the dead, in forces that transcend our material understanding. I do not ask you to abandon those beliefs. I ask only that you consider a more prosaic explanation for what occurred here." He crossed to the wardrobe and gestured upward. "The ceiling of this room is not what it appears to be. Behind the decorative plasterwork, concealed for more than a century, is a hatch that opens into the attic above. This hatch was created during the original construction of the house, as part of the servants' infrastructure, a way for maintenance to be performed, for access to be gained to spaces between floors, for the invisible labor of the household to occur without disturbing the family's comfort." With practiced ease, Holmes stepped onto the wardrobe and reached up to tap the ceiling in a specific rhythm. The sound echoed hollow, clearly different from the solid plaster elsewhere, and Watson saw comprehension beginning to dawn on several faces. "The hatch can be opened from above," Holmes explained, "allowing someone positioned in the attic to descend into this room without using the door or windows. They would need only to step down onto this wardrobe. You can see fresh scuff marks on its surface if you look closely, and then reverse the process to return to the attic. With the proper timing, such entry and exit could occur completely undetected." He reached up and, with a gentle push, dislodged the section of decorative plaster that had been carefully crafted to appear original. It came away cleanly, revealing the rectangular opening to the attic above and the wooden boards that could be lifted to create access. Several guests gasped, and Mrs. Ashford pressed a hand to her mouth. This is how Mr. Carstairs entered this room, or rather, how his body was brought here after he was killed elsewhere, Holmes said, replacing the panel carefully. He died the attic above, struck from behind with a single blow to the base of the skull, then hidden among the dust sheets and old sea chests until the proper moment for staging this elaborate tableau. He stepped down from the wardrobe and turned to face the assembled guests. The thread web itself was prepared in advance, using 500 yards of Belgian silk upholstery thread purchased 3 weeks ago from Threadneedle and Sons in Clerkenwell. The purchaser gave a false name, but was seen and can be identified. The knots used to secure the threads are sailors' knots, running bowlines and sheet bends, tied, with the precision that comes from years of practice, or from being taught by someone with naval experience. The entire construction was designed to suggest supernatural agency while concealing a very human method. Watson watched Sarah Hewitt's face. She had gone very pale, but she stood straight and still, her eyes fixed on Holmes with an expression that mingled fear and a strange kind of relief, as though the weight of carrying this secret alone had become unbearable. The timing was crucial, Holmes continued. Mr. Carstairs had to be killed before the Friday Salon, but his body kept hidden until the perfect moment for discovery. That moment came during the piano recital that was part of last week's gathering, specifically during Chopin's Ballad No. 1, a piece that runs approximately 9 minutes and contains several fortissimo passages loud enough to mask any sounds from the room above. While the guests sat downstairs in the drawing room, listening to music, someone descended from the attic, positioned Mr. Carstairs' body in the pre-prepared thread web, and returned to the attic before the performance ended. The locked room mystery was complete. A body in a sealed chamber, apparently placed there by forces beyond mortal understanding. Mrs. Pennington spoke for the first time, her voice trembling. But who, Mr. Holmes, who could have done such a thing, and why? Holmes's gaze moved deliberately to Sarah Hewitt, and every eye in the room followed. "Miss Hewitt," he said gently, "would you like to explain, or shall I?" For a long moment, Sarah Hewitt said nothing. Then, with visible effort, she straightened her shoulders and spoke in a voice that was quiet but clear. "I will explain, Mr. Holmes. These people deserve to understand, and my brother deserves to have the truth known." She looked around the room, meeting each gaze in turn. "My name is Sarah Hewitt. My brother Billy served aboard the Indomitable, under Commander Ashford, Mrs. Ashford's late husband. In 1888, during an engagement at Zanzibar, my brother lost his arm in an ammunition explosion. He was 19 years old, and he saved 3 men's lives before the blast took his limb. He was promised a pension commensurate with his bravery and his sacrifice." Her voice gained strength as she continued. "But there was an inquiry. Questions were raised about whether proper safety protocols had been followed aboard ship. The official conclusion was that everything had been done correctly, that the explosion was simply the tragic cost of naval warfare. My brother's pension was reduced accordingly. What they did not say, what they buried in official files and convenient forgetfulness, was that my brother had reported safety concerns to his commanding officer and had been told not to make trouble. What they did not say was that munitions were stored improperly to save time and effort, that corners were cut, that negligence cost my brother his arm and his future." Mrs. Pennington had gone white. Her husband, the undersecretary, had placed a hand on her arm, his face rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. "For years I fought," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wrote letters, attended offices, begged for someone to listen, to review the case, to acknowledge that my brother had been wronged. I was turned away every time. And then Mr. Carstairs appeared, claiming to have letters, correspondence from one of the officers involved, letters that admitted the truth of what had happened. He offered to give them to me for £500, or to sell them to the very people who wanted them buried. £500 that I could never earn. That would take me a decade of sowing to accumulate if I never ate or paid rent or did anything but work." She drew a shaking breath. "I killed him. I lured him here with a promise that I had found the money, led him to the attic on a pretext, and struck him from behind. I knew about the hidden hatch. My father was a carpenter who worked on houses like this one, who taught me about their secret architectures. I knew about the knots. My brother taught me before he went to sea, showed me the sailor's craft that was his pride and his skill. I knew about Mrs. Ashford's Friday salons because I had visited this house seeking employment, had been shown kindness by Jennings, had learned the rhythms of the household." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. "I planned it carefully, Mr. Holmes. The thread to suggest spiritualism and misdirection, the locked room to create impossibility, the theatrical staging to make it seem like something beyond human agency. I wanted it to be unsolvable, or if solved, to point toward the supernatural rather than toward a desperate seamstress seeking justice for her brother." Holmes's expression was grave, but not without compassion. "And the letters? Did you recover them from Carstairs' body?" Sarah nodded. "They were in his coat pocket. I have them still. Letters from Lieutenant Pemberton to his wife, written during the voyage, expressing concerns about munition storage, about pressure from above to cut corners, about his own culpability in allowing unsafe practices to continue. Letters that prove my brother told the truth and was punished for it." The Undersecretary stepped forward, his face ashen. "Lieutenant Pemberton is now Admiral Pemberton," he said quietly. "He commands the Mediterranean fleet. These letters, if made public, would destroy his career and create a scandal that would reach the highest levels of the Admiralty. But more than that," his voice caught, "they would reveal that my wife and I have known about this injustice for years and have done nothing to correct it." Mrs. Pennington was weeping now, her elegant composure shattered. "James Pemberton is my cousin," she said. "When he learned that Carstairs had obtained his letters, he came to us for help. We paid Carstairs to keep them secret, paid him more than once. And when your brother's sister came seeking justice, seeking review of the case, I used my husband's influence to ensure those requests were quietly buried. I told myself it was to protect my cousin's career, to prevent scandal. But truly, I was protecting my own position, my husband's advancement, the comfortable life I have built." The room had fallen into shocked silence. Watson felt the weight of revelation, the way truth could shift the moral landscape of a situation until certainty became confusion, and condemnation became understanding. Holmes spoke into the quiet, his voice gentle but firm. "I have spent my career investigating crimes, uncovering secrets, bringing wrongdoers to justice. But I have also learned that justice is not always simple, that right and wrong are not always clearly delineated, that the law and morality do not always align. Miss Hewitt committed murder. That is an undeniable fact. But She did so to protect her brother from a man who was exploiting his suffering in a system that had already betrayed him once and would betray him again. He turned to Mrs. Ashford. The decision of what happens next is not mine alone to make, but I would offer a suggestion, if I may. Mrs. Ashford nodded, unable to speak. The letters that Miss Hewitt possesses could be given to the Admiralty with a request for a full review of Billy Hewitt's case, Holmes said. The Undersecretary, if he wished to demonstrate genuine contrition, could use his influence to ensure that review is thorough and honest, that the truth is acknowledged, that Billy Hewitt's pension is restored to what it should have been 9 years ago. Admiral Pemberton's career would likely end, but given the circumstances, that seems an appropriate consequence for negligence that cost a young sailor his arm. He paused, letting the words settle. As for Miss Hewitt herself, there are places in the world where a woman with her skills could begin again, could build a life for herself and her brother far from London and its memories. Australia, perhaps, where the colonies are always in need of skilled seamstresses, and where former naval men can find employment and respect. If such an emigration were to occur quietly, if Miss Hewitt were to disappear before charges could be formally brought, the case might remain officially unsolved. Another locked-room mystery attributed to the strange forces that seem to occasionally manifest in old houses. The Undersecretary and his wife exchanged glances. Watson could see the calculation happening, the weighing of scandal against conscience, of career against redemption. "I will ensure the review happens," the Undersecretary said finally. "I will use every bit of influence I possess to see that Billy Hewitt receives justice, that the truth is acknowledged, that his pension is restored with interest for the years it was wrongfully withheld. And I will not oppose any arrangements that might be made for Miss Hewitt's quiet departure from England." Sarah Hewitt had collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that were equal parts relief and grief. Mrs. Ashford moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. One widow to another woman who understood loss and desperation. "The salon will not continue," Mrs. Ashford said quietly. "I think we have all learned something about the dangers of seeking easy answers to difficult questions, about the ways we deceive ourselves and others in pursuit of comfort or advantage. But this house will stand, and its secret passages will keep their secrets a little longer." Holmes began the careful process of dismantling the red thread web, pulling it down like a curtain falling on a stage. The crimson silk pooled on the floor, beautiful and terrible, the material evidence of a crime born from injustice and desperation. Watson helped, winding the thread carefully, thinking about all the threads that had woven through this case, literal and metaphorical, visible and hidden. The thread of Sarah Hewitt's devotion to her brother, the thread of official corruption and willful blindness, the thread of Carstairs's greed connecting victims across social strata, the thread of Holmes's investigation pulling everything toward revelation, and, perhaps, toward a kind of mercy. By the time they finished, Sarah Hewitt had composed herself enough to stand. "What happens now?" she asked Holmes. "Now," Holmes said, "you go home to your brother. You tell him what has happened, what will happen. You prepare for a long journey to a place where you can both begin again, where the shadow of this will not follow you. You have perhaps a week before questions become urgent, before my silence on this matter becomes complicity that I cannot sustain. Use that week wisely." She nodded, then did something Watson did not expect. She stepped forward and took Holmes's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for mercy I do not deserve, but for understanding what drove me to this, for seeing my brother's suffering even as you uncovered my crime." "I see everything, Miss Hewitt," Holmes said quietly. "That is both my gift and my curse. Go now, and may you find peace in whatever future you build." She left, and the other guests followed, dispersing into the November night like spirits themselves, each carrying the weight of what they had witnessed and learned. Watson and Holmes were the last to leave, Mrs. Ashford seeing them to the door with gratitude that seemed almost like mourning. The fog had returned, thick and soft, wrapping Bloomsbury in grey silence. They walked without speaking for several minutes, letting the quiet of the city at night work its peculiar magic, letting the complexity of the evening settle into memory and understanding. "Did we do the right thing, Holmes?" Watson asked, finally. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his footsteps measured on the damp pavement. "I did what seemed just, Watson, which is not always the same as what is legal. Sarah Hewitt will live with what she has done for the rest of her life. That is a sentence no court could impose. And Billy Hewitt will receive the justice that was denied him 9 years ago. As for Carstairs, he was a man who traded in human misery, and he died by the hand of someone whose misery he sought to exploit. I cannot mourn him." They had reached Baker Street now, their lodgings glowing warmly ahead, Mrs. Hudson's curtains drawn against the fog. Watson thought of their sitting-room fire, of hot tea and perhaps a brandy, of the ordinary comfort of familiar walls and the friendship that had sustained them through so many extraordinary cases. "The Red Thread Room," he said softly. "It will make a strange addition to your casebook." "Record it if you wish, Watson," Holmes said as they climbed the stairs to 221B. "But perhaps leave it unpublished for a few years, until distance has rendered. It's safely historical rather than dangerously current. Some stories are better told in retrospect, when the actors have finished their parts and moved on to other stages." Inside, the fire was indeed burning, and Mrs. Hudson had left a tray with tea and cold supper. They settled into their chairs, and Watson felt the familiar satisfaction of a case concluded, even if the conclusion was ambiguous, even if justice had taken a form that the law might not recognize. Outside, London breathed and shifted, a city of millions of stories, millions of threads weaving together in patterns too complex for any single observer to fully comprehend. But Holmes had pulled at this one thread until its pattern revealed itself, until truth emerged from deception and understanding from mystery. And that, Watson thought as he sipped his tea and watched the fire dance, was enough. The red thread had been unravelled. The room had yielded its secrets. And somewhere in the fog-wrapped city, a woman and her brother were preparing for a journey toward a future that offered, if not redemption, then at least the possibility of peace.